Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we are speaking with Dr. Laurence Vance about anti-discrimination laws and the transgender bathroom controversy. Dr. Vance is the editor of the Classic Reprints series and the director of the Francis Wayland Institute. He is the author of 24 books, including War, Empire, and the Military, Essays on the Follies of War and U.S. Foreign Policy, and The War on Drugs is a War on Freedom. And he has written over 600 articles and book reviews. He is a regular columnist at LouRockwell.com and also writes a column for the Future of Freedom Foundation. You can follow his work at vancepublications.com. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/transgender-bathrooms. Dr. Vance, welcome to the show.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. So let's just get started with a definition of what anti-discrimination laws are, and then a little background of how they came to be, how they originated.
Well, anti-discrimination laws basically originated with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, when the government basically told private businesses that you cannot exclude doing business with certain people based on their race, their color, their religion. And then this was later expanded to include people's age and their sex. So basically, that's how it got started.
So in what ways do anti-discrimination laws violate the principles of self-ownership and private property and freedom of association?
Well, they directly violate not only freedom of association, but freedom of assembly. They violate free thought. Anti-discrimination laws basically criminalize what you think about certain people or certain groups of people. So anti-discrimination laws are bad in so many different ways because they criminalize free thought, free association, free assembly. They violate your private property rights. So any kind of discrimination law about anything is bad and has always been bad.
And they also potentially force interactions between people who have no desire to interact with each other.
Exactly. It's government-forced integration, whether it's race, religion, or gender, or anything else.
Can you give us some examples of modern-day anti-discrimination laws in practice and how they're enforced and when are they enforced?
Well, for instance, you have the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which enforces employment discrimination laws. So anybody who belongs to some kind of protected group, which nowadays is basically anyone but a white male, you can file a complaint and say you didn't get a particular job because you're discriminated against based on your age or your gender or your religion or your race or your national origin or any number of different things that the government has labeled people being in some kind of protected class.
And how frequently are these laws enforced? It seems like there aren't very many people who actually discriminate or intend to discriminate based on race or religion or anything like that. So how often are these laws enforced, and what's the reality behind the instances in which they're enforced?
Well, I think they're enforced quite a bit because the EEOC is a huge federal agency, and then on the state level you have similar organizations, and even on the county level you have similar organizations. And I don't think it's actually a case of discrimination. I just think it's people upset about something, and that's why they're filing these complaints to try to get the government to do something. I think actual cases of real discrimination based on, let's say, a white business owner doesn't want a black man in his store, I think those things are so minuscule nowadays.
And a lot of the enforcement is kind of self-enforced, right? Because you're opening your company up to a ton of liability, especially now in the era of social media. if you're accused of being discriminatory in any way, that's very, very negative publicity for you and your company. So it's in your best interests to always err on the side of safety whenever trying to make sure that you do not violate any of these anti-discrimination laws.
Right. The word discrimination has been made into this dirty word, basically, where all you have to do is mention the word discrimination and people just freak out. So what happens is employers, they do have to self-police themselves so they don't get in trouble with the government. And they'll basically have a quota system and make sure they have enough blacks, enough Hispanics, enough women in their place of business just to cover themselves so they don't get charged with being discriminatory. Although I might point out that it doesn't work the other way. For instance, the NBA, nobody's suing the NBA saying they don't have enough white. It never seems to go that way. It's always the other way.
No, that's a great point. The NBA and other professional sports organizations and some entertainment organizations and in some other areas of society, you have organizations that are predominantly non-white at a disproportionate rate to the overall population, and it never goes that way. It never works that way. These complaints never operate in that direction.
And I think what opponents would say, and I think I'd like to know how you'd respond to this, is many people who hear that complaint would say, well, white people have not faced the historical limitations that a lot of these protected groups by governments have, and therefore it is not necessary for the government to intervene in the situation where there's not a lot of, say, white males in a certain group or a certain occupation. So what would you say to people who claimed that there's kind of a very historical hindrance on a lot of these protected groups, and so they need to be protected by the government?
Well, there's no question that many years ago in our history we did have these problems, but to perpetually think you have to protect certain groups for 500 years because of this is just ridiculous.
Well, and in a lot of cases, it was the government that was causing this discrimination or slavery or whatever they want to point to in the first place, whether it be laws against teaching slaves to read or laws against slave revolts or whether it be forced discrimination in certain areas. A lot of the time, the government was the main driver behind discrimination.
Well, I would say most of the time. You take the Jim Crow laws in the segregated South. These were government laws, and they hurt white businesses because the government told white businesses, you have to have separate drinking fountains, you have to have separate waiting rooms, you have to have separate restrooms. Whereas if it was up to the business owner, he may not have wanted to do that. So the government is the problem to begin with.
Right, especially in the Southeast, but also in other parts of the U.S., these black codes and Jim Crow laws prevented business owners from having access to as many potential customers as they otherwise would have. And in the absence of government, they may very well have had access to all of those other potential customers.
Exactly.
So let's move forward to sort of the last 10, 15 years. And one of the main issues that seems to crop up from the sort of anti-discrimination proponents are issues surrounding so-called LGBT communities. So how did the gay marriage controversy help bridge the gap, bridge the transition from the Civil Rights Act and anti-discrimination laws of prior decades to where we are today?
Well, the whole gay marriage thing, most of these states where gay marriage was legalized was not due to a referendum or a legislative act. It was due to federal court decisions that imposed these things on the states. And what this did is it brought the cries of these people forward, even though it's a small minority of people. And they're never satisfied with any so-called rights that they get. As this bathroom controversy shows, they're not satisfied with having a gender-neutral bathroom that they could use. That's not good enough. They're not satisfied until they can actually go into a bathroom that they have no business being in because it's for the opposite sex. And speaking of the civil rights movement, blacks should be highly offended that this modern LGBT anti-discrimination movement compares itself to blacks fighting for their civil rights.
Right, and there was no slavery background to this whole LGBT issue
exactly.
Either.
So, can you explain? There's been a lot of bills recently that have been called these religious liberty bills. What are they? How have they originated? And what are their merits and costs?
Well, the religious liberty bills originated out of this legalization of same-sex marriage, because then you had certain businesses that perform wedding-related services, like a baker for a wedding cake, or a photographer for the wedding, or maybe a florist to provide flowers for the wedding. And a lot of these people are Christians or religious people, and they don't believe in gay marriage. They would gladly sell items to people that came in their store, and they're not going to question their sexuality, but they're not going to actively participate in, let's say, photographing a wedding. And then you've had some lawsuits where people have sued, saying that they were denied the services of a florist or a baker or a photographer because they were in a same-sex relationship. So they've sued, and I believe in every one of these cases, the business owner has lost and has been fined or has been forced to provide these services. And I know some businesses have actually quit providing certain services like baking wedding cakes because of this. So what has happened is some legislatures have passed religious liberty bills in which they've tried to say that if you have a religious reason to deny people service, that your business is allowed to do that if it's a religious reason. So these are religious liberty bills, and they've passed in a few states, and of course they're challenged as legalizing discrimination, which of course all discrimination should be legal against any customer in any form and for any cause. In a free society, at least, that's how it would be. So the religious liberty bills are an attempt by certain state legislatures to give people a little bit of freedom. Now, these same legislatures, here's the problem. The same legislatures that pass these religious liberty bills, they have no concept of what a free society actually is. They would still say you can't discriminate based on race, or religion, or a whole list of other things. And they would want to fine you and imprison you or put you out of business if you did that. So I just think it's kind of ridiculous that they're trying to allow people to discriminate in this one little area, but they miss the big picture. And that is, in a free society, any business owner would be able to discriminate against anybody for any reason.
And it is frustrating sometimes because of just the names of these bills, right? They're always called anti-discrimination laws or religious liberty bills. And so a lot of times the arguments that you hear are framed around, well, discrimination is bad, so anti-discrimination is good, religious liberty is good. But really all of these laws, all they have to do with is property rights. And if I own, a bakery, do I have the right to sell my baked goods to whomever I choose, and also choose not to sell my baked goods to whomever I choose. And I think that's really the crux of a lot of these laws, and it'd be nice if there was more focus on that issue instead of getting all caught up in, oh, well, what if you're this religion? Can you discriminate against this person?
Right.
I think it completely misses the point, like you were saying.
The government is making this arbitrary distinction between your home and your business. If you don't want to let people of a certain race or religion into your home, you're perfectly free to deny them access to your home, and they would be laughed out of court if they tried to sue. But yet, if you own a business, the government says you can't do the same thing. You cannot exclude certain people from your business. You cannot not serve people. You cannot not rent your house or your apartment to a certain group of people.
Yeah, and I mean, as Adam pointed out before, in the case of the Jim Crow laws, in the absence of these laws, really both sides would be better off. If you didn't have these anti-discrimination laws, for instance, with the case of the baker could choose to sell to whomever he chooses, and if there's someone who's homosexual who wishes to purchase from this baker and they don't want to purchase from him, well, that homosexual is going to go to a bake shop that will. So I think really in the end it will promote people to not discriminate, because if you're discriminating, you're losing out on business. So the folks who discriminate are already put at a disadvantage, and eventually they'd lose out.
Well, I made up an example in an article one time. So suppose someone wanted to open the homophobic cafe, and they wanted to post a sign on the door that said "No LGBT allowed entrance." Now, what would happen? Well, it could result in a lack of business, not just from LGBT people, but maybe their families, their friends, and maybe sympathetic people who hated bigotry in any form. So they might lose a lot of business. But on the other hand, it might attract customers who maybe they were paranoid about eating in a restaurant with a homosexual, or something like that. So any business in a free society, even if a business owner, let's say, didn't like Jews or blacks or Hispanics or whatever, he still may not want to discriminate because it'd be bad for business. But the issue has to be the business owner should have the freedom to operate his business as he chooses. And if he wants to discriminate against a certain class of people and lose business because of it, that's his business. It's not the government's business, and it's not the business of these do-gooders in society who want to stamp out all discrimination.
No, absolutely. It's sort of like a modern form of Puritanism, I guess, where they're trying to stamp out various things and using the state as part of that. But on the religious liberty bills, one point I want to make is that it almost turns the government into a validator of certain religions and an invalidator of other religions, because they're clearly going to say that certain acts of discrimination are not based on valid religious reasons, and that they're just acts of discrimination for other purposes. So it almost turns the government into deciding what is a valid religious belief and what is not a valid religious belief.
That's exactly true. And something that happened a few years ago, you may remember, is I think it was a group of Native Americans, Indians, to not be politically correct, and they wanted to smoke some kind of substance in their religious rituals, and I don't know if it was marijuana or something similar, and there was court cases over this where the government had to decide if this particular religion was allowed to do this, whereas a Catholic or a Presbyterian or a Baptist, if they had made this argument, it would have been shot down. So yes, you're exactly right. It makes the government the arbiter of of what is a genuine religion and when discrimination could be practiced or couldn't be practiced.
Right. So let's turn to the current controversy in North Carolina. What is the controversy there, and what is this bill that's at the center of the controversy?
Well, this all started back in February, I believe, in Charlotte, North Carolina. And the city of Charlotte amended their city code, which already contained a whole list of classes where you couldn't discriminate, right? You couldn't discriminate based on race, sex, religion, national origin, age, stuff like that. So what they did is they added to their city code in 10 different places, they added discrimination based on marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. What happened, though, is they also deleted a section of the city code that allowed discrimination to take place when it came to restrooms, shower rooms, bathhouses, and similar facilities. So basically what Charlotte did is said, if you identify as a different gender, you can go ahead and use that bathroom. Well, a month later, the North Carolina state legislature got together and they passed, I believe it's HB 2, which requires that you can only use a bathroom based on your biological sex, the sex according to your birth certificate. And that's the big controversy right now, that HB 2 that was passed. The ACLU calls it the most extreme anti-LGBT measure in the country. And of course, the bill is not against LGBT people. It doesn't make homosexuality illegal. It doesn't say that homosexuals should be arrested. It doesn't say you can discriminate against homosexuals or transgender or whatever. All it says is if you're born a male and you have male equipment, you go to the male restroom. And actually, since HB 2 has passed, the governor even signed an executive order protecting and enhancing the rights of LGBT people. So the HB 2 is not an attack on LGBT people at all. It's just restoring common sense and decency to keep male sexual predators who claim that they feel like a female for that day from going in the female restroom.
Now, in a more free society, wouldn't it be better not to have this bill? Because it is forcing people to do things, and generally as libertarians, we are against force. So what would you say to libertarians who say that, these sorts of laws aren't necessary?
Well, this bill just deals with public agencies. This bill does not mandate that private businesses cannot have, their own restroom policy. So any private business is allowed to let anybody into either restroom. That's not what the bill is about at all. And in a free society, that's how it would actually be. If you are a corporation or you're just a small mom and pop business, doesn't matter, and you want to have your restrooms available to anybody that wants to use them, then that's your business. You can do that. Now, it might cost you business. For instance, Target just announced that Target said, we welcome transgender team members, that's their employees, and guests to use the restroom or fitting room that corresponds with their gender identity. Now, because Target did that, I think over 1 million people now have signed a petition saying they're going to boycott Target and they're not going to shop there. And I know Target's stock price has plummeted as well because of this decision. So in a free society, a business would be able to make their own restroom policy. And if you didn't like it, you could just shop somewhere else. And that's exactly what's happened right now with Target.
So just to clarify, because this is a point that is not being made in the mainstream media, but the North Carolina bill has nothing to do with telling private business owners what customers can and can't do in their stores, whereas the decisions made by the government of the city of Charlotte do have a direct impact in forcing private business owners to behave in a certain way.
Exactly, because the Charlotte ordinance says that any business has to permit this. So yes, that's the crucial difference that you just mentioned right there.
All right.
So the North Carolina bill has to do with freedom. The Charlotte bill that they tried to enact has to do with government decree.
Right, and that's a very important point to make and a very important distinction to bring up. And it's one that is completely missed by, well, maybe they probably don't even care in the mainstream media, but to the extent that anyone would care in that realm, it's completely missed.
Well, here's another thing that people miss when it comes to discrimination. If individuals or groups of people can legally discriminate against companies and businesses and corporations and refuse to engage in commerce with them for whatever reason, it's perfectly legal, right? If you decide, I don't want to go to 7-Eleven forever and I'm never going again, and you may have some stupid reason, it doesn't matter. You're not going to get arrested for it. You're not going to get persecuted by the government for it. So individuals and groups of people can discriminate freely against any kind of business for any reason, no matter how ridiculous. But yet at the same time, a company or a business or a corporation can't likewise discriminate against an individual or a group or a class of people. So society is just totally crazy, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. But I want to turn our attention to some other LGBT and transgender controversies, because this seems to really have extended to the military, to Medicaid, Medicare, and all sorts of other government institutions. So what is the situation there? And also, how is this forcing the taxpayers to pay for sex change surgeries or other operations or procedures that they're not necessarily in favor of?
Well, this has been building in the military for some time. You know, at one time, homosexuals were not allowed in the military, and then that was changed. And then I think I saw a report. There's like 15,000 transgender people in the military, but they have to still keep it in the closet, so to speak. It's not officially legalized yet, but it's going that way. And I've tracked the progress of this in different blog posts on LouRockwell.com. I can't remember all the details at this moment, but there's coming a day when it's going to be 100% perfectly acceptable in the military for anybody to be openly transgender. So what's going to happen is, since you have free medical care in the military, the taxpayers are going to be paying for these surgeries for people to change their gender. They're going to be paying for the medication and the hormones and all this kind of stuff. And military doctors, what if a military doctor is a religious person and he says, well, I don't want to help someone change their sex? Well, then he's going to be persecuted by the military because of that. So it's just opening up a can of worms that you're never going to get closed.
Right. So for those who are opposed to this sort of thing, it's yet another reason not to join the military.
And,
exactly. Among the hundred other reasons, like, right. Invading, occupying, and killing.
Right.
You would think that maybe conservative Christians, would at least now not join the military. And I blogged just a few months ago that the military is now doing penis transplants for soldiers who've gotten their member blown off, in Afghanistan. Well, what's next? Next in the military, it's going to be, transplants, not because you got something blown off, but because you want to become a man. So that's what's coming. And I suspect in the prison system as well. If you're a prisoner and you want to identify as a different sex, I suspect the next thing is going to be the taxpayers are going to fund that as well.
Yes, it is quite interesting, I would say. For me, I think the biggest issue here is really just too much government in the first place. I think a lot of these issues wouldn't be an issue if we didn't have a massive military. It wouldn't be as much of an issue. Personally,
exactly.
I would have been very much pro LGBT, but for me, what's most important is letting people do what they want with their stuff. So when it comes to the government and their decisions on how they should treat other people in the government, I'd like it if there was just less government overall. We wouldn't even have to ask these questions.
Exactly. The government is the problem. I mean, Reagan used to say that, but of course he didn't mean it at all, typical conservative. But the problem is government. Without the government, if you're a business owner, your property is your property. If you don't want to let people with red hair in your restaurant, then that's your business. And someone with red hair can just go to another restaurant. End of story. No lawsuits. No court system, no money wasted, no lawyers. That's how a free society would operate. And of course, we don't have a free society in the United States. I mean, Americans sing "Land of the Free, Home of the Brave," and they cheer while these military jets fly over the football stadium. But we don't have a free society in the United States, not at all. I mean, the government regulates the amount of water that your toilet's allowed to flush. You got to get a permit to have a garage sale in many places in the United States. We don't live in a free society at all.
No, and in many ways, it's just a lot of empty sloganeering when you hear this stuff about land of the free or the U.S. being number one in freedom. It's just not true. If it ever was true, it's definitely not true now.
Well, I'll tell you, I did some research recently for an article, and you have these indexes of economic freedom that are put out every year by like the Wall Street Journal, Heritage Foundation, places like that. And the U.S. is never in the top 10 when it comes to economic freedom. And then when you look at other things like freedom of the press, the U.S. is way down, like, number 30, 40, and 50, behind Canada and Estonia and places like that. So Americans are deceived thinking that they live in a free country. They're comparing us to North Korea or Sudan, something like that. And therefore they say, oh, yeah, we live in a free country. Look at North Korea, look at Cuba, look at Sudan. But there's a lot of other countries in the world, 190 something. And Americans, they just don't look around and see what's going on.
So where do you see the conversation on these topics heading, especially in the context of what we were saying before, how it's very difficult to even start a conversation on topics like this without being branded as a bigot or racist? It seems that any conversation you try to have is immediately shut down, and you're subject to lots of social shaming if you decide that you're on the wrong side, quote unquote, of this debate. So where do you see the conversation headed?
Well, I think it's going to get worse. Discrimination is the worst, swear word that there is now. If you're a discriminator, I mean, that's worse than being a rapist, I suppose. So things are going to get worse, and eventually the federal government is going to step in, and all these religious liberty bills and all these laws, like in North Carolina, trying to bring some decency back to restroom use, I think it's all going to be overturned by the feds. For instance, actually just today, I read something in the New York Times that the Justice Department has now sent a letter to the governor of North Carolina saying that this HB2 violates Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. So the federal government's already stepping in and putting a stop to this. So things are going to get worse. And I don't look for a Republican administration to reverse anything.
Yeah, and on top of everything else, as you said, we're going to see a greater concentration of power in the federal government, and less power for the state governments to the extent that they have any power right now.
Exactly. And all this is being done to appease straight white liberals. If you look at the number of people that are actually transgender in the country, it's got to be like 0.02%, something like that. And then if you look at the number of people that identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, it's just a few percentage points of people. So why is everybody bending over backwards to give special rights to all these people? And it's straight white liberals that are behind the whole thing, that do the, publicly shame you if you, are accused of being a discriminator.
It's unfortunate that the argument has to be framed in that way, and hopefully folks will try to think of it in a different direction, especially the property rights direction. I think it's just the best way to think of this argument. I think it leads to best outcomes too, in the end.
For everyone, yes.
Well, so on that note, what do you recommend those who are interested in learning more about this subject? What do you recommend they read, and then where can people follow your work?
Well, I write a lot about discrimination issues for LouRockwell.com. And that's where I would recommend that people go, not just for my articles, but for the many good articles that you'll find every day on LouRockwell.com.
All right, well, great. I just want to remind everybody to go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/transgender-bathrooms. That's the show notes page for this episode, and we'll link to Vance Publications. We'll link to LouRockwell.com. Future Freedom Foundation, everything we've discussed here. So that's wakeupcallpodcast.com/transgender-bathrooms. And I also want to encourage everybody to follow us on Twitter. We just got a Twitter account. So at WUC Podcast is the place to follow us on Twitter. And on that note, Dr. Vance, I want to thank you for being so generous with your time and for joining us today to talk about this controversial issue in a way that people probably won't hear from the mainstream media. So thank you, and we'd love to speak with you again sometime.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.